Welcome to the Swindon Spring Festival. Now, we hope all is well where you are. And we had, of course, hoped to be presenting live events in theatres and libraries and even in parks in May in Swindon. But that nasty little virus and the restrictions to try to contain it means we can now only have a virtual festival. And part of the virtual festival is this virtual session today on the book Digging Up Britain. Here it is, Digging Up Britain. It covers 1,000,000 years of history, nay, prehistory, and 10 remarkable discoveries, which are the result of astounding and recent archaeological methods of uncovering our past. Please join me in giving a Swindon Spring Festival welcome to its author, writer on all things archaeological, and editor of the British Archaeology magazine, Mike Pitts. Mike, welcome.
Matt, thank you. It's great to be here, as it were, if only we were actually together in Swindon, but this is pretty good.
Well, as you say, we were meant to be live in Swindon, and in May, Swindon is terrific. We would have liked to see you here live. In fact, have you ever been to Swindon?
Oh, yeah. I live just down the road. I'm in Marlborough now. And of course, Swindon, there are all sorts of reasons to go to Swindon, which I've always liked Swindon. Even before Historic England National Trust had their offices there, which are now, for me, of course, as a historian and archaeologist, are a huge draw. The archives, particularly Historic England, are just extraordinary.
Yeah, and some people say Swindon is terrific for all sorts of reasons. It has a great history with its football club, but then they also say, and it's near Avebury.
Yeah, you know what? I never say Avebury's near Swindon, which is what I always used to say. I lived in Avebury quite a few years, and I always used to say to people, "Where's?" You know, they say, "Where's Avebury?" I say, "It's near Swindon."
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Now we'll go to your book. It has great notes. It has great further reading, and every chapter is a story of its own, which is terrific. And I wonder, why did you choose to write this book and these 10 stories, not from the past to the present, which is the usual way, but from the present to the distant past? Over to you, Mike.
That's a great question. I mean, what happened is during the course of writing the book, somehow I found myself telling the story that way, and then I had to sort of ask myself why I was doing it like that. And I mean, a flippant answer would be that it actually makes you think about the past differently. It's not the way it's normally told, as you say. And so doing it this way means that whatever you know about ancient Britain, you're going to find the story different. So, and that's actually works quite well, because most of us I think if we think about the ancient past at all, so we think about Stone Age, for example, we think of primitive people and primitive times, technologies and so on, and we think, how did they manage without medicine, without metal, without fridges or whatever it might be? And actually that's turning everything upside down, because of course if you were alive in the Stone Age, you didn't know anything about fridges, so you didn't miss fridges. You had your own ways of dealing with things. And somehow actually going backwards means that if, for example, I'm talking about the time of Stonehenge, I'm looking at, with the reader, we're looking at Stonehenge from a perspective of looking backwards into the past, the people who are at Stonehenge, which is what they would have been conscious of. And they probably knew a lot more about their recent past than we could ever know. But at the same time, in a strange way, we already know much more about their more remote past than they could possibly have imagined. And that perspective, I think, you know, it helps us think our way into the past, I think. There are other reasons. I think as an archaeologist, and any archaeologist watching this will understand, when we work in the field, when we excavate, we go backwards. You know, when you're digging, you start, like if you think of Richard III, for example, the first thing that archaeologists had to do was take the tarmac off the bottom of the car park and then work down through Victorian surfaces and drains and things, and then back into the Middle Ages. And that's how it works physically, archaeologically. So you're thinking all the time when you dig in reverse, as it were. And then when you tell the story, you turn it around the other way. But I thought, well, no, let's not turn it around. Let's keep it around this way. I like it like this. And the effect is almost, when you read the book right through from start to finish, the effect is almost of creating a kind of sense you get from reading science fiction, I think, that the world's become increasingly remote and strange, and you're looking through, it's like you're looking out into space, you're looking out into infinity and wondering what on earth's out there. And as you know, as you get through the book, you get a glimpse of things that are further and further away, which are actually, because they are so far away in time from us and in culture, and towards the end of the book, we get to even different human species. They become increasingly hard for us to understand and increasingly remote. So what I did was, I thought I'll tell this story about ancient Britain, which is something I've wanted to do, I think probably like many archaeologists, you know, for most of my writing career. And it's always been an incredibly difficult thing to do. It's been a real challenge. And I thought what I'd do is I'd tell it through 10 excavations. And each of these excavations is new. So even if you think you're quite familiar with British archaeology, the story that comes through is entirely new because the excavations are new. But they're new in other ways as well, because what's happening in archaeology now is so different. I mean, I've been editing British Archaeology magazine for about 15 years, which is a long time. But during those 15 years, more scientific techniques, more new ideas, more new technologies, ways of understanding the past have appeared in the pages of those magazines than were around when I was a student, that had accumulated over centuries. And the actual edition of the magazine I'm working on at the moment has got 2 new dating techniques in it. And so the science of archaeology is really changing and is bringing us so much stuff that when I was a student, we never imagined it would be possible that we could learn about. But as well as that, there's a huge, unprecedented amount of new information coming out. And there are a number of ways that's happening. And one of the biggest is construction. Now, construction workers are, as we know, are back on the scene now, but they are preceded on many, many sites, particularly the large construction projects, almost invariably, before the workers start, there are archaeologists on site. And archaeology driven by construction has generated an enormous amount of new information. This goes back to planning guidance that was brought in the 1990s. So we've had this now for a few decades. And this incredible amount of information has come out of the ground because of this. But there are other things as well. Another is detectorists. And they are finding extraordinary things. In fact, one of the chapters in the book is about the Staffordshire Hoard. And that, of course, was found by one man with a metal detector. And that discovery unleashed an enormous amount of research and scientific study that was only completed as I was writing the book. And in fact, the final study, the report, was published after Digging Up Britain came out. And there also, we have, because of largely the construction projects, we have more archaeologists employed in this country than has ever been the case before. There are something in the order of 7,000. And there is this great community of curiosity that's driven particularly by university research, where we have global leaders in archaeology, as we do in excavation, and an international kind of fire that was particularly strengthened by our presence in the EU, where we had people from all over the world, and particularly Europe, coming to work in Britain and contribute their ideas. And these and many other things mean that what's happening in archaeology now is incredibly exciting. It's very difficult to keep up with, and it's just changing everything we thought we knew about the remote past. And so what I've tried to do in the book is not sort of swamp you with all this stuff, as perhaps I've just done, but just take it through the stories of individual excavations and the people who were on these sites. And very often, of course, in these really great discoveries and these dramatic, unexpected stories that emerge from the ground, it affects the archaeologists themselves. You know, their careers change, or the way they think about themselves change. And so these are great stories. And through these excavations, and I hope to carry you along and learn a bit about the science and the way this works, but also, of course, about our island story, about how this all meshes together to create a picture of ancient Britain. And we start with an excavation in Dorset, near Weymouth, where there was a mass grave of Viking men, mostly young men, who'd been all been beheaded and buried. And we go back through the Staffordshire Hoard, this fantastic treasure, into Roman London, which was one of the really big recent development-led excavations at the Bloomberg headquarters in the centre of the city, where there's an extraordinary amount of Roman material came out with some really great stories. And then back into prehistory. I've got one site in Scotland, which is in southwest Scotland, Dumfries and Galloway, a site called Black Loch, which was a research project paid for by Scotland's national heritage body, and with university archaeologists working on a site where they have exceptional preservation. There's a waterlogged little Iron Age village, very small, almost a chiefdom's sort of settlement, just a big house and a few little huts and things around it. And the water, it was built on a tiny little sort of peninsula jutting out into the edge of a lake. And even as they were building these houses out of wood and laying down wooden floors and standing up posts and everything, the houses were sinking into the mire, and this material was preserved for eternity by the waterlogging, along with everything that was dropped on the floor. It's the most extraordinary thing. And then backwards, we got Must Farm, which many people will have heard of, has been in the news a lot, is another waterlogged village, in this case in Cambridgeshire, a late Bronze Age village that was built on stilts above the edge of a river, and within possibly less than a year, even a few months after it was built, it was burnt to a cinder, and the whole thing toppled over into the river, quite possibly deliberate arson. Of course, we have no idea why. None of the people who were in these houses fell into the river. They escaped, or possibly they weren't in the houses at the time they were burnt down. But other than that, everything that was in the houses is there. So their food, their tools, there may be the odd dog or lamb that was actually alive inside the buildings, all their pots and utensils and everything just plunged into the water. And anything that wasn't completely carbonized and burnt is there perfectly preserved. And it is the story of a complete community preserved in the peats and muds at the Cambridgeshire Fens. And then we go backwards. I go to Stonehenge. I couldn't resist Stonehenge, I mean, partly because it's an area that I've been involved in all my career. I mean, even going back to childhood, when I was at school, I wrote a dissertation about Wiltshire, Henges, Stonehenge and Avebury and so on. And that is actually the reason, Avebury, why I now live in Wiltshire, because one of my very first jobs was coming out to Wiltshire to be curated at the little museum in Avebury. And I've excavated at Stonehenge. So I tell the story of Stonehenge, but there we have some major excavation that have been taking place just outside the World Heritage Site, where the army has been expanding housing on a grand scale to accommodate soldiers coming back from Germany. And all these housing estates have been preceded by really large excavations, which have found an extraordinary amount of stuff that helps us understand the world of the people who built Stonehenge. And we keep going backward. We go ultimately to hunter-gatherers, a site in Yorkshire, another site that's exceptionally preserved with waterlogging, where you've got wood and so on that preserved, and we go right back. The last major excavation I talk about is about 400,000 years old in Suffolk, and it's like several of these projects, it's continuing. They would have been excavating this summer. It's a bit unlikely at the moment, I think, but it's a university, it's a research-based and a museum-based project. And what's interesting there is it looks like they're going to get evidence for the first convincing sound evidence for the use of fire in Britain 400,000 years ago. And it's a complex story, so I won't sort of try and get it right now, but essentially with the stone tools and the various animals that are preserved and so on, there are suggestions that there are actually two different human species there, quite close together in time. And ultimately we just take it back through other stuff down to nearly 1 million years ago when we have footprints on a beach in Norfolk. And that's the story of digging out Britain.
Mike, thank you very much. And as you were talking, I was thinking of numerous questions, and I thought, should we have that one at the end, or should we have that one at the beginning? But I think we'll have a kind of tricky one at the beginning, which is that you say somewhere in your book that for 1 or 2 million years, stone has been something that people have done, that human beings have done. And I kept thinking as I was reading these stories, and they're terrific stories, is that you could call it stone stories, the stories that stones tell us. And all the time you are telling us stories that you've sort of uncovered from stone. You haven't chiseled out of stone, but you've uncovered from stone. And I'm thinking he's also making, he's telling things about people from those stones. And in your opening, in your very opening words of the book, you say this: when I began studying archaeology, humans were thought to have reached Britain 200,000 years ago. We now know that people have been here for at least 850,000 years, perhaps 950,000, depending on how we read the evidence. Few archaeologists would be greatly surprised if new discoveries were to show that people have been in Britain for over 1 million years. And then in your last chapter, in chapter 10, you talk about who is a Briton, what makes someone a Briton. And here you are talking of somewhere between 800,000 and maybe 1 million years of history on this island. And you raise the question, immigrants, Britons, who can claim to be a Briton?
I think anybody living here is a Briton, or who has lived here is a Briton. I think one of the really interesting things that has emerged very recently, particularly with the arrival of ancient DNA on the scene, and the first ancient human genomes were published only as I was writing this book, so this remains a very new science. But what that has confirmed from other scientific evidence that's been accumulating recently is that one of the really distinctive features of the whole of our story, going right back, not just in the past few centuries or through the Middle Ages, but back through entire prehistory, is that Britain is distinguished by the amount of movement, by travel, by people moving about. And that's within the islands and around the islands, and also from outside and back again. And I reckon during that nearly 1 million years, there may have been as many as 20 occasions in which the population of Britain was either entirely or substantially replaced. And if you go right back, you're talking about one species, one human species, replacing another species. And during the ice ages, up until say 15,000 years ago, Britain was saw a succession of cold and warm eras, and by that I mean very cold. And at the most extreme times, there was solid ice, in some cases miles thick, reaching from southern England, from around the level of the Thames, covering the whole of the rest of the British Isles and most of Ireland. And at times like that, Britain would have been entirely uninhabitable, not just by humans, but almost any living thing. And when that happened, and there are humans in Europe at the time, then people moved south and moved east, away from the cold climates. And then as it warmed again, which it regularly did, sometimes to, as was the case in fact at Barnum, to slightly warmer than it is today in Britain, then then bit by bit life returns. And so first of all, you get grasses and shrubs and small animals, and gradually the whole fauna and flora of temperate Europe, or even Mediterranean Europe, comes back into Britain, and with them all the time are humans, as long as Britain is physically part of the European continent, because, you know, 500,000 years ago, people didn't have boats in Europe, and it does look, there is one occasion when the climate is really warm and is hospitable, and Britain is full of really good plants and animals for people, but there are no humans. And archaeologists have struggled for some time trying to figure out why that's the case. And the most likely explanation seems to be that the particular timing meant that people were not able simply to walk across from continental Europe into Britain, but the English Channel intervened. And then you get to about 11,000 years ago, and by then modern humans all over Europe, and people come into Britain and then they never leave. So we have been here, modern humans have been in Britain continuously for about 11,300 years without a break. And so one way and another, whatever's happened between then and now, there's going to be an element of those first people 11,300 years ago in us. And I mean, in all of us, because if you work back from the present and think of family tree, how family trees expand, for each generation, you're doubling the immediate descendants. Your parents have 4 parents, you have 4 grandparents, and so on and so on. And by the time you get to 11,000 years ago, effectively everybody on the planet is related today. So even if you've arrived, say, from the tip of South America into Britain today, you are actually genetically about as related to people in Britain 11,000 years ago as somebody who was born in Wiltshire. And yet, in those 11,000 years, the archaeology is very clear about there being almost continuous movement across the Channel, and the Channel itself appeared for good around 8,000 years ago. And we got boats to show people we're crossing the Channel, but also we've got all sorts of physical evidence in the form of trade, ores, raw materials, and the DNA is now confirming that we can see different peoples appearing. And there are 2 occasions during these 11,000 years when there is a very substantial population replacement. The British genome, as it were, almost entirely changes. One of those, interestingly, is about the time Stonehenge is built. And there's a really interesting series of questions that surround that. Is exactly what happened then? You know, is it possible that the migrants coming in from Europe built Stonehenge, or did they adopt it? Did they work with the people? Did they come because of Stonehenge? Did they destroy it? Did they attack it? And at the moment, those are questions that have never been asked really before by archaeologists. And at the moment, our chronology, our dating of Stonehenge is just not good enough for us to really know who built it and exactly what happened when. And that's clearly something that we need to address in the future. And then there was another occasion going back about 6,000 years ago when farming first arrived. And it's very clear that that wasn't something that happened just by native hunter-gatherers thinking, I feel like a bit of beef, I go across to France and borrow a cow. You know, all the domestic animals and crops, the cereals that we still grow, wheat, oats, barley, pigs, cattle, sheep, were physically brought across the Channel by people who've been farming over there for many generations before they decided to come to Britain. And the hunter-gatherers, the native hunter-gatherers, almost completely disappeared. Certainly in the genome, they almost entirely vanish. In the archaeology, because probably they're such a sparse population, you know, they're so thinly scattered, and they leave very trace. They trod very lightly on the landscape. If you've got a few hundred or a few thousand hunter-gatherers scattered across the British Isles for a few generations, then for archaeology, they're almost invisible anyway. So we don't know, again, exactly what happened then. But we just, this is a recurrent theme, and I think it's the defining theme for Britain, is this idea that we are all migrants. We're all descended from migrants. And I think what makes us British in particular is a combination of that and simply the places where we live, the landscape we know, the places we were born in and we grew up in, the towns we know, and the history and the archaeology and those past lives that lie out in the landscape beneath our feet.
Yes, and really, now that you've given such a splendid answer, I'll say it was a slightly sort of fatuous question, because it's a sort of topical thing that people say, who's British and who isn't. And,
no, it's. I think it's an important question. I mean, it's a complex question. But I think it's one I think about a lot.
And again, in a sort of more topical and lighter way, but nevertheless, or slightly kind of wind up controversial way, in the way they do on TV debates, where they try to crank things up. The linked question is something you say in chapter 8 when you talk about Goff's Cave and Sylvia Bello, and you say somewhere that Britons, not somewhere in Africa or America or somewhere else, or Pacific Islands, but that Britons may have been the earliest cannibals. And a minute ago you said, a couple of times you've actually used the phrase, archaeology is very clear. In other words, the evidence is concrete, or let's say it's stone. Britons, the earliest cannibals?
Not necessarily the earliest, because we have evidence for people eating people in a few other places in Europe around about the same time. So I think this is, what's happening in Goff's Cave in Somerset at that time is part of a European phenomena. And it's possible that these things are happening elsewhere for different reasons. I mean, with pretty good evidence, for example, that over 500,000 years ago, that early humans were eating other humans in Spain, where there are exceptionally well preserved fossils, and it may well be that the same was happening in other parts of the world at the same time. But what happens in Goff's Cave, I think, is particularly interesting because, first of all, these are modern humans. So these are people like us. These are not another species. And they are the people, in quotation marks, the people who painted the caves in Ice Age Europe, who created this fantastic art of featuring these Ice Age animals, reindeer and bear and great cattle and lions and so on, and art that I think we all recognise as being something that is distinctively human, distinctively modern human, that is immensely powerful, and often people talk about it. Art historians talk about it in a kind of cultural sense, that there's something about this art that makes these people like us, sophisticated, cultured, modern humans. And I think, in some respects, it's quite a shock to find that the very people who created this art could be cannibals. And indeed, one of the elements of the story at Goff's Cave is that we actually see some of this art engraved into human bones that have been chewed by people. And it was that discovery of that art by Sylvia Bello, you mentioned, who is working at the Natural History Museum in London, who examined these bones, she thinks, that held the key to the story. And some people would argue that it's not art, but Sylvia's argument is it's abstract grooves in a kind of jagged mountainous strip. And some people will argue it's not art, but Sylvia's case is that exactly the same devices occur on other material in a Europe of the same date that are actually components of bigger artistic creations where nobody would dispute that it was art. So on this little bone, you've got these little grooves. And what's interesting about them is that they are carved onto the bone, obviously after the individual had died. We don't know how any of these people died instantly. And the best guess is actually they probably died naturally. and there are teeth marks in this art. So making that art, engraving this bone, was actually part of the process of consuming the flesh that was on that bone. And so from that, Sylvia thinks that the cannibalization was a ritual thing. It wasn't just that people enjoyed eating people, or that they were starving, and that, you know, a bit like the Peruvian plane crash, they had no option but to do something they would otherwise never have considered to survive. But actually they were doing this out of respect for the dead, that this was part of their way, part of the way in which they processed the idea that these people they loved had died. And so that, if you like, it's almost a funerary ritual, in modern terms we would say. And so there's something, it requires a lot of imagination, I think, but you know, she's arguing almost there's something tender in the way that people were eating each other. So that's Goff's Cave.
That's Goff's Cave. Thanks, Mike. I want to make our penultimate question one that I can't resist asking, because this is the Swindon Spring Festival, and Swindon is in Wiltshire, 33 miles from Stonehenge. And there are so many other questions I could ask about the stories in this book, but I do want to come to Stonehenge before we run out of time, and begin by reading the opening paragraph of chapter 6. The more we learn about Stonehenge, the more we realize how extraordinary it was, even at the time that it was built. Its meaning and its origins tell us not just of Salisbury Plain, nor Wessex, nor southern England. It is the creation of islands, of generations of people from Land's End to the Orkneys. It is a memorial to a defining era of British culture and history. It is 2,500 years of identity, a crumbled ruin lording it over miles and miles of buried lives, now being exposed as never before. It is a story only archaeology could have told. You make great claims for archaeology and Stonehenge. I love it, by the way.
Thank you. Yes, well, I think, I mean, it's something, you know, as an archaeologist who's engaged with Stonehenge, like a lot of my colleagues, for a long time, sometimes it's easy to forget how extraordinary the place is. You know, and you get kind of obsessed with details of trying to work out what happened, when, where, and you're gazing into holes in the ground and beavering away in museums, and you can forget just how utterly extraordinary Stonehenge is. There is really nothing like it anywhere else on the planet. And it's only recently, in the past sort of decade or so, that we're really starting to understand the world that created that monument and the people who did it. We're going to see, I hope, later this year, the first in a succession of great studies is going to appear. Reports on excavations that have been done around Stonehenge in the past couple of decades. That's happened on a scale that's never happened before. These are research excavations close to Stonehenge at places like Woodhenge and Darrington Walls, the monuments we knew already but knew little about. And a huge amount of research expertise has been thrown at these sites and at the excavations. And there's just so much new is going to come out of that. And of course, in addition, is the stuff that I actually write about in the book a bit, which is these that I mentioned earlier, the excavations taking place just outside the World Heritage Site on these military housing estates. And again, there's a great deal of new information there. And most of this we've yet to, you know, absorb and accommodate. It's still being studied and hasn't been analysed and published. And even the stones themselves, I mean, English Heritage a few years ago conducted a laser scan of the megaliths. And this was the first time really that archaeologists have properly considered the stones, which just, you know, if you think about it, I mean, I'm sure for anybody who's not an archaeologist, it's pretty obviously extraordinary, but for an archaeologist, you have to think about it, think, hang on, why didn't we do this? You know, it's just ridiculous. And even now, I think we actually, you know, technology is advanced. We would profit from going back to Stonehenge again to study those megaliths in greater detail, higher resolution. And to even the most basic stuff, we have a lot to learn and there's an awful lot of information in the pipeline coming along. And I think Stonehenge kind of embodies in some ways for me, you know, everything that's happening in archaeology in Britain and beyond.
And it's sad for the people who like to go there in the middle of June, that this year coronavirus
Yes.
has...
Well, not least, I mean, you know, the solstice, presumably, one imagines that there will be nobody at Stonehenge other than a few guardians on the 21st of June, which will be possibly the first time it's ever happened since it was built.
No, it's deeply disturbing in one sense anyway. I want to roll the last question, two questions into one. One of them is a question I would have asked you right at the start had you been live in Swindon. And the other is a kind of question towards the end. And well, let's see. I want to know why didn't you become a doctor or a dentist or a plumber or an electrician? How did archaeology come to matter to you? And now that we know it matters to you, you mentioned school, and now you're a mature man, so you've obviously been doing it for a few years. This is such an obvious question. The answer may be obvious, but it isn't entirely obvious. Why does it matter? Why does the past matter? Because there are many people who don't read our books the way some people do. For example, I just want to tell you something that maybe it partly answers the question, but you'll have your own answer. When my mother died, we found a stack of letters that she kept, that we didn't know that she kept. And suddenly what was contained in them made something else matter, which up to that point hadn't mattered. We'd been living our lives perfectly well without the evidence of what we as children had written to our mother. But then when it came to light, it added something new to our lives. Does knowing our past add something new to our lives? And why are you an archaeologist, not a plumber? Okay,
let's take that last question first. I'm not a plumber because, as my wife will tell you if she was here, I'm absolutely no good at it. I can barely change a washer. But if I was going to be anything other than an archaeologist from my childhood, it would have been a farmer, because I grew up on a farm. And that partly accounts for what happened, because when I was working out in the fields, I started finding things in the ground, wandering around in my lunch breaks. And I found things like I found a Neolithic flint arrowhead, for example. And at the time, this was in West Sussex, at the time, all those many years ago, the archaeological convention was that there were no prehistoric people living in that part of the country. And I was finding all this stuff, and that kind of, you know, I found that quite exciting, that I was thinking, not only was I finding things and they were fun to look at, but also I was thinking, look, I can rewrite stories, you know, I can find things that where people say they shouldn't be. And by complete chance at school, I had a classics teacher whose brother was an archaeologist who worked at the British Museum and who taught A-level archaeology. And it's a long story, but I ended up doing A-level archaeology, and I just went to university and carried on like that. So it's a series of accidents, really. And what I liked in the early days, what I particularly liked about archaeology, and I still enjoy, is that sheer sense of a quest, of discovery, of this idea that you can rewrite stories, you can find things yourself. And you don't actually have to be an archaeologist to do that. You know, many of the great ideas, the great discoveries are owed to people who are not professional archaeologists. I mean, in the book, for example, I mentioned the Staffordshire Hoard. I mean, this guy, Terry, he was just a bloke with a metal detector. And he did the right thing, you know, acted responsibly, found this extraordinary thing, and it really changed people's lives, that discovery. And my favourite, I mean, I won't go on, but my favourite, and I've told this in another book, Hingeworld, but my favourite personal discovery is a haul of hundreds of human skeletons in the basement of the Natural History Museum, which effectively nobody knew was there. And among them were a handful excavated in Wiltshire, one of which was from Avebury, the famous barber surgeon in Avebury, and there was also a skeleton from Stonehenge, which when we examined it turned out to have been beheaded, and we radiocarbon dated and found it was an Anglo-Saxon man, and so on. And you know, just making these discoveries is the most extraordinary thing. It's very exciting. it's like being an investigative journalist, but without anybody sort of complaining about what you're doing or trying to sue you for it. Now, does it matter? I mean, in some ways, I would say no, it doesn't. If it doesn't matter to you personally, then that's fine. That's your choice. That's how you think about the world. I'd like to suggest that maybe, if you read a book like Digging Up Britain, you might find that there's something in there that would make you think otherwise. But it does matter, certainly for many of us. And you mentioned, if you have a death in the family, one of the effects of that is that you think about somebody completely differently, and you're taken back into another world by thinking about their lives, and your relationship changes. And there's something about engaging with a past, particularly a really long past, that I find almost soothing. Like at the moment we're grappling with the most extraordinary and horrific things happening around the world. And there's something in thinking, well, people have lived and done all the exciting things that they were able to do with their lives, and suffered and died. And this has been going on for generation after generation after generation. And we're just part of that bigger pattern, that bigger scheme of things. And in the end, everything settles down and moves on. And there's nothing much that we can suffer now that somebody hasn't faced in the past. And that I find there's an element of comfort in that, and actually being out here in Wiltshire, being out on the downs, say, and just looking at, and you can see, with an archaeological eye, you can see the shapes and the effects created by people over thousands of years in the landscape, and just reflect on that huge span of time and all the people who created this world. And I think there's a space there that is a good to be sometimes.
I think you're so right. It's so obvious, Mike, and it makes life much more meaningful. The Victorians used to write books on the art of living, implying that just eating and sleeping and one or two other activities is not quite enough for us. So this is part of the art of living. And by the way, I too would have become a farmer had I not realized that you have to milk cows on Christmas Day, Boxing Day, and every blooming day.
Yeah. To be honest, I just found it boring. That was my problem, just sitting on a tractor going up and down a field for hours. And also, it would be horrible out in the weather. Ugh.
Well, you had a tractor. We only had Shire horses.
Yeah, I'm not quite that old, but we did have to say, when I was a kid, we had all the kit for the horses was hanging up in buildings on the farm, so they hadn't been long gone. And I think that's partly because my granddad was a great farmer, but he was quite slow in moving with the times.
As you can see, folks, Mike and I are just getting going. And if he had been live in Swindon, we'd have ended this event shortly. We'd have got these books, which would have been on a stall in the foyer. And then we'd have gone back to Lower Shore Farm or to the pub and carried on the conversation. But that's not possible now. This is a virtual event. And at the moment, it's just Mike and me talking to one another. And we hope you're listening. We wish you were here. We hope you are well. We hope you keep well. And will you please join me in giving a Swindon Spring Festival thank you to Mike Pitts. Mike, thank you very much.
Matt, it's been my pleasure.
Thank you for watching this virtual session at the Swindon Spring Festival of Literature and the Arts 2020. We do hope you enjoyed it. And we also hope that you will join us for the rest of this virtual festival. Here for you are details of the author you have just watched, their book, and our online information. Thank you very much for joining us, and keep well till we meet again.